Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon tonight. We tell the story of a slave girl, broken by years of abuse, who rose in one night of fury and struck back against her master. A single act that ended in blood and shook all of American history. The heat of the southern summer clung heavy in the air, and the fields stretched wide and endless under. The sunrows of cotton bent low with white blooms, and behind them bent the backs of enslaved men, women, and children, their fingers raw, their clothes tattered, their breaths shallow but steady. Among them was a young girl named Sarah. She was no more than 12 when her name was entered into the ledger of a man whose cruelty would become the center of her life, and eventually the reason for his end. Sarah had been born into bondage on another plantation, but when debts forced her former owner to sell off what he called his property, she was torn from her mother's arms and carried down the river to the estate of Master Jonathan Hale, a man known across the county for both his wealth and his merciless temper. The girl cried out for her mother as the wagon carried her away, but her sobs fell into the hot wind unheard by any who cared. Hale stood tall at the porch when she arrived, his shadow stretching across the steps. His eyes ran over the new slaves with a cold sort of satisfaction. When his gaze landed on Sarah, he did not see a child, only a body he owned. She felt the weight of that look, though she could not name it then. From the very first night, Sarah learned what life in the Hale household would mean. She was not sent to the quarters with the other field hands. Instead, she was kept inside the big house, given work that never ended, scrubbing floors until her knees bled, carrying water until her arms shook, and tending to Hale's every demand. He would call her name with a sharp snap of his fingers, and she had to come running without delay. If she stumbled or hesitated, the whip would kiss her skin. Sarah grew thin, but she did not break her spirit, clung to the fading memory of her mother's lullabies, whispers of comfort she repeated to herself when the nights turned dark. Years passed, and Sarah's body grew, though her heart still longed for a freedom she could not imagine. Hale saw her growth too, not with kindness, but with the hunger of a man who believed every life in his grasp belonged to him. She was 15 when his footsteps began to follow her down the hall at night. The creak of the wooden floor outside her small corner room became a sound of dread. His hands were rough, his breath soured by whiskey, his words low threats that bound her tighter than any chain. She was a child forced into a woman's torment, but no one in that house lifted a hand to stop it. The other slaves looked away, their silence not from cruelty, but from fear. They knew that to speak would bring ruin on them. All Sarah carried his abuse in silence, her face calm in the daylight, her voice soft when she answered yes sir, no sir. She hid the storms that raged inside. She knew crying out would change nothing. Yet in her chest, a seed of rage began to grow, watered by each blow, each night, each humiliation. That seed was quiet at first, only a whisper of defiance, but it lived. There were moments when Sarah thought perhaps she could endure until the end of her days. That was the way of most slaves, to bend and bend until the body gave out and the grave offered rest. But fate had other plans. One evening, after the fields were gathered and the house dimmed, Hay returned drunk from town. His rage was stoked by a gambling loss, and he turned it on Sarah with blows that sent her crashing to the floor. He cursed her, calling her filth, less than an animal. And when he dragged her up by the hair and pressed a knife to her cheek, threatening to carve her face if she dared look away, something inside her shifted. The fear that had kept her chained for so long began to burn away, leaving behind something fierce and unyielding. She said nothing, not then. She swallowed her screams and bowed her head. But that night, as she lay in her cot, staring at the ceiling boards, she knew she would not live her life as prey. She would not go to her grave with his hand still clutching her throat. One day she would rise. The days that followed were a blur of labor, but beneath the surface, Sarah's mind worked. She began to study Hale's habits, the times he drank, the places he kept his weapons, the moments when his guard slipped. She listened to whispers from the other slaves about revolts long crushed in men who had dared to strike back. She knew the risk. She knew that should she raise her hand against her master, there would be no mercy, no pardon, but she also knew that her life as it stood was already a kind of death in the cool hush of dawn when the fields lay waiting and the whip had not yet cracked. Sarah would sit by the edge of the quarters and think she thought of her mother's face, now faded in memory. She thought of freedom, though she had never touched it. She thought of Hale, sleeping soundly in his grand bed, while she counted bruises on her skin. The fire inside her grew each day until it filled her chest like a storm waiting to break. Night had happened, the cicadas sang loud in the trees, and the moon cast long silver beams through the windows. Hale had been drinking more than usual. His footsteps thundered in the hall, and his anger spilled into shouts that woke the house. Sarah knew, before he even called her name, what was coming. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the certainty that this was the night she rose from her cot, her hands steady though her breath shook. She had hidden a small blade days before, a knife left unattended in the kitchen. It was nothing compared to the master's weapons, but it was sharp enough when Hale pulled her into his chamber and shoved her to the floor. Sarah did not weep. She did not beg. She let him believe she was broken, as she always had been. Then, when his hand reached for his belt, when his body leaned heavy over hers, she struck. The blade cut through the air and into flesh. His howl split the silence of the house. He staggered, blood spilling down his shirt. Sarah rose with a strength she had never known. She drove the knife again and again, her cries mingling with his, until his body slumped lifeless to the floor. For a moment the world held still. The fire in the hearth crackled, the cicadas sang, the night pressed close. Sarah stood, trembling, her hands slick with blood. She had done what no slave was meant to do. She had killed the man who claimed her. She had taken back her body, her life, in a single storm of fury. But the silence could not last. The sound of footsteps, the gasps of servants, the rush of voices soon filled the air. They found her standing over him, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. They dragged her away bound, her wrists tight, though she did not resist. She knew this was only the beginning. Her act would not end with the master's death. It would carry her into the cold hands of the law, into a trial that would stir the nation and force men to ask what justice meant when spoken in the shadow of slavery. On so Sarah's journey moved from the walls of Hale's house to the bars of a jail cell. The town buzzed with the tale. A slave girl had killed her master. It was a crime unthinkable, yet undeniable. People whispered her name on the streets, some with horror, others with a quiet awe. The courthouse doors would soon open, and inside them history would be written in ink and blood. The jail was a stone box with iron bars that swallowed sound and hope. Sarah sat on the cold floor, her wrists rubbed raw by the rope that had bound her the night after the killing stretched long and empty. Her heart still thundered in her chest, not from fear, but from the echo of what she had done. She had lived under Hale's hand for years, bowed and silent, but in one breath, one strike, she had undone him. The weight of it pressed heavy, but beneath it pulsed a strange, unfamiliar thing. Freedom. It was a fleeting freedom, bound by bars and destined to be tried by men who would never see her as anything but property. Yet for the first time she had chosen her own faith. The town stirred like a hive. Disturbed word spread, quick, faster than the river that cut through the county. A slave girl had killed her master. People gathered in doorways, on porches, along fences, to trade the cuts. Some spat in disgust, calling her a monster who had turned against her owner. Others whispered of the years of cruelty they had heard of behind the walls of Hale's estate. The truth was known in fragments pieced together by gossip, but no one could deny the fact. Hale lay in his parlor covered by a sheet, and Sarah sat in the jail, accused of murder. The sheriff, a stout man with a red face, visited her cell on the second day. His boots clanged against the floor as he approached. He stared at her through the bars, shaking his head, as if looking at something unnatural. "You've done it. Now, girl," he muttered. "You'll hang sure as the sun rises." Sarah said nothing. Her eyes did not drop as they once would have. She met his stare, steady, though her body trembled when he turned away. Her fellow slaves whispered about her fate when they were made to pass near the jail on errands. They did not dare stop, but their glances carried messages. Some looked at her with sorrow, knowing she would be made an example. Others with awe, a spark of pride hidden in their eyes. Sarah felt both. She had broken the rule that bound them all. She had struck where none had dared. She had done what many only dreamed in their darkest hours. The town's leaders gathered in the courthouse days after Hale's death to set the trial. The room was crowded with white men whose voices carried weight in the county. Planters, merchants, lawyers, all spoke of the crime. Some demanded quick punishment, the gallows erected without delay. Others insisted on a trial, though not out of mercy, but for order. The killing had shaken them, not just because a master lay dead, but because the delicate web of power that held slavery in place had trembled. If one slave could rise and kill, who was to say others would not follow? The trial date was set, and word traveled across counties, drawing men and women to witness what was already being called the most controversial case they had ever seen. The courthouse would not only decide Sarah's fate, it would stand as a test of the very system that kept thousands in chains. Sarah's nights in jail were long. She prayed, though not with words she had been taught. She prayed with the memory of her mother's face, with the whisper of her own voice, promising she would not bow again. She thought of Hale, his body heavy on the floor. And she did not regret. She thought of freedom not as a dream, but as a question: would she find it in life or only in death? When the morning of the trial arrived, the town swelled with people. Wagons lined the dirt road. Horses tied to posts snorted in the heat. The courthouse stood tall at the center, its steps crowded with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Women clutched fans against the sun. Men smoked pipes, murmuring in low tones. Everyone waited to see the girl who had dared spill her master's blood. Inside the courtroom, the air was stifling. Dust floated in the light that cut through tall windows. The judge sat high in his chair, a man known for his stern rulings. The jury was made of 12 white men, their faces grave, some tight with anger, others unreadable. The benches groaned under the weight of townsfolk, their whispers rising and falling like the hum of bees. At the front, chained and watched by guards, sat Sarah. Her dress was plain, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes lifted once to the crowd, then lowered again. The room fell silent. As the trial began, the prosecutor rose first, his voice sharp and cutting. He painted Sarah as a wild creature filled with violence, ungrateful to the master who had clothed and fed her. He spoke of the sanctity of property, of the laws broken by her hand. He told the jury that if she were not punished, others would rise. The fields would burn. The order of the South would crumble. His words dripped with fear, masked as righteousness. And many in the crowd nodded along when it came time for Sarah to answer. She was given a lawyer, a man appointed not from kindness, but from duty. His name was William Carter, a young attorney who had little standing in the county. Some whispered he was a fool to defend a slave girl accused of murder, yet Carter stood tall. Though his hands trembled, he did not deny the act. Sarah had killed her master, but he spoke of the years of torment, the cruelty that had driven her to it. He told the jury that though the law called her property, she was flesh and blood. She had endured pain beyond measure, until at last she defended herself. Courtroom shifted, uneasy at his words. Some hissed, others sat stone still. For the first time, the story of Hale's cruelty was spoken aloud within walls of power. His nights of drunken rage, his blows, his threats, his assaults, all laid bare. The truth cracked through the silence like a whip. Sarah herself was called to speak. The guards brought her to the stand, her chains rattling. She lifted her chin, her voice soft but steady. She told them of the nights she had prayed for mercy that never came, of the fear that had lived in her bones since she was a child, of the moment when fear turned to fire. She did not cry, though her eyes shone. She said she had no choice. That she killed to survive each word carried weight, falling into the hearts of those who listened. Some looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Others leaned forward, caught in her quiet strength. Outside the courthouse, crowds waited for scraps of news. Each shout from within carried to the street. People debated hotly, some declaring she was nothing but a killer, others whispering that maybe, just maybe, she had been right. The trial stretched for days. Witnesses were called. Slaves who had served in the Hale household spoke carefully, their words shaped by fear, but the truth slipped through. One told of Hale's rages, another of Sarah's bruises. Some trembled as they spoke, knowing their testimony might doom them, but they did not lie by. The time the closing arguments came, the air was thick with tension. The prosecutor thundered about law and order, warning of chaos if Sarah went unpunished. He pointed to her with a shaking hand, declaring that mercy for her meant death for masters everywhere. Then Carter stood one last time. His voice cracked but grew strong. He said Sarah had been forced into a life no human should bear, that she had lived in chains, beaten and used until she struck back. He asked the jury to see not a slave, not property, but a human being driven to the edge. Jury left to deliberate, and the courthouse buzzed like a storm. The crowd outside swelled, restless, waiting for a verdict. Hours past, shadows stretched long across the dirt road. Still the jury did not return. Some whispered that the case had split them, that even among men who held slaves doubt had crept in. Sarah sat in her chains, her face calm. She had faced Hale's cruelty. She had faced the court. She could face whatever came next, but deep inside, a flicker of hope trembled, fragile as a flame in the wind. Maybe for once her voice had been heard. Maybe for once the world would see her not as a thing, but as a woman. The jury's footsteps echoed like thunder as they filed back into the courtroom. The room rose as one body's shifting, benches creaking. The judge's gavel struck, and the hum of whispers fell into silence. Sarah's hands trembled, though she forced them still in her lap. The air was thick with heat and breath, every eye fixed on the men who now carried her. Faith, a foreman, stood, his paper shaking in his grip. His eyes darted once toward Sarah, then back to the judge. His voice cracked, guilty of murder in the first degree. A collective gasp rose through the room. Some cried out in triumph, others in horror. The sound crashed against the walls and spilled into the street, where the crowd surged, restless to hear the word. The sentence was clear: death by hanging. Sarah did not weep. She bowed her head once, as if a weight she had long carried was finally named. The guards moved to pull her back to her chains, but she stood on her own. She walked from the stand with steady steps, her face calm, while the courtroom roared around her. She had known from the moment her blade struck flesh that this day would come yet. There was a stillness in her heart, not peace, but certainty. She had lived one moment as free, and no gallows could take that from her. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like fire through dry grass. A slave girl condemned to hang for the murder of her master. The crowd broke into factions. Some cheered, declaring justice had been served. Others whispered with unease. They spoke of Hale's cruelty, of the scars on Sarah's skin, of the trembling voices of those who testified. The town buzzed with arguments, spilling into taverns and porches and fields. The trial had ended, but the story had only begun. Word carried beyond the county. Riders took the news to neighboring towns, then to cities, where papers printed bold headlines: Slave Girl Kills, Master Trial Ends in Death Sentence. Columns filled with descriptions of the courtroom, the witnesses, the young woman whose voice had carried like a bell against the silence of slavery. Some papers praised the verdict, declaring it a defense of order. Others questioned whether justice could exist in a system where one half of humanity held the other half in chains. For the enslaved, who heard the story in hushed whispers by firelight or in corners of the fields, Sarah became more than a girl condemned. She became a symbol. Her name carried like a prayer. Sarah, the one who rose. Sarah, who fought back. Sarah, who dared. In their eyes, her fate was tragic, but her act was defiance, and that seed of defiance sank deep into hearts that had Long been silent in the weeks that followed, Sarah's cell became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Some dared to press notes into the cracks of the stone, scraps of cloth or flowers stolen from fields. They could not speak to her openly, but they left tokens, small acts of solidarity. She would find them on the floor of her cell in the morning, and her hands would close around them, her heart lifting with the knowledge she was not forgotten. The sheriff complained of the growing unrest. He urged the judge to carry out the sentence quickly, to silence the whispers. But appeals were filed, not by Sarah herself, but by William Carter, the young lawyer who had stood by her side. He had been changed by the trial. His words, once uncertain, now burned with conviction. He wrote letters to courts in distant cities, to editors of newspapers, pleading that Sarah's case was not just about murder, but about the cruel reality of slavery itself. His words stirred debate in parlors and studies among men who had never before thought of the slaves in their fields as anything but tools. Each delay in the execution fueled more talk. Crowds gathered at the jail, not always with kindness. Some came to jeer, to spit through the bars, to curse her name. Others came silent, to stand watch, as if their presence alone could shield her. Sarah bore both with quiet grace. She did not rise to anger nor to sorrow. She sat in her cell, hands folded, eyes steady. She had faced worse than their words. She had faced Hellas. The weeks bled into months. The case reached beyond the South, into the halls of abolitionist circles in the North. Pamphlets were printed with Sarah's name, speeches given in churches and town halls. Her story was told as proof of the brutality of slavery, proof that even a young girl could be driven to kill rather than endure another night under her master's hand. They called her brave, they called her victim, they called her martyr. Some even wrote songs, sung in sorrowful tones in the glow of candlelight. Yet, for every voice raised in her defense, others rose louder in rage. Southern papers printed warnings. They said Sarah's act was not isolated, but a sign of a greater danger. They urged masters to tighten their grip, to watch their slaves closer, to crush any spark of rebellion before it spread. In plantations across the region, punishments grew harsher, patrols more vigilant, the lash sang more often. As fear tightened its hold, Sarah's blade had cut deep, not just into Hale's body, but into the fragile order that held the South together. Sarah herself heard little of this debate. Locked behind stone walls, her world had shrunk to a cell, a narrow window, a sliver of sky. But within that sliver she found strength. She whispered to herself in the dark, sometimes her mother's songs, sometimes prayers, sometimes nothing but silence. She was not afraid of death, she told herself. She had already faced it many nights in Hale's chamber. She had taken her fate in her hands, and that could not be taken back. Day of her execution was finally set. A chill autumn wind swept the town as carpenters built the gallows in the square. Crowds gathered from miles around, wagons creaking down the roads, their wheels cutting deep into the mud. Vendors sold food, children clung to their mothers, men argued politics. The execution had become spectacle. The morning of the hanging, Sarah was led from her cell. Her steps were steady, though her ankles were bound. Her dress clean, but plain, her hair tied back. She carried no words for the guards, no pleas for mercy, as she climbed into the cart that would bear her to the square. Her eyes lifted once to the gray sky above. A flock of birds cut across it, wings flashing in the light. And she let the sight fill her. The square was thick with people, their breath fogging in the cold. The gallows loomed tall, its rope swaying in the wind. Some shouted curses, others wept softly, but all fell into silence as Sarah was brought forth. She stood beneath the noose, her face pale but calm. The preacher offered her final words. She bowed her head, but when she lifted it, her voice carried clear. I was a child, and he took everything from me. I chose to live for one moment as mine, not his. That is all. The crowd stirred her words, settling heavy among them. The executioner stepped forward, the rope placed around her neck. The world seemed to hold still. Sarah closed her eyes, her lips moved in a whisper only she could hear. The trap gave way, the rope snapped taut, and her body hung still. The crowd gasped, some turned away, others watched, unblinking. The gavel of the law had struck. The girl who killed her master was gone, but her story had already broken free from that square, carried in the mouths of those who watched, in the pages of newspapers, in the whispers of slaves by firelight. Sarah's life ended on the gallows, but her defiance lived on in the weeks after her death. Her name became legend in quiet corners. She was spoken of, not as a killer, but as a girl who refused to bow. Slaves told her story to their children, a tale of courage and cost. Abolitionists carried her memory into speeches, into papers, into halls where freedom was debated. Her act sharpened the division of a nation. Already cracking, Sarah's body was laid in an unmarked grave by the edge of the town, but her spirit could not be buried. The soil itself seemed to hold her memory, her blade cutting through history like a wound that would not close in the silence of that graveyard beneath. The sway of trees her story whispered, still a reminder that even in chains, a soul could rise, even in darkness, a flame could burn. The gallows had been taken down by the time the next dawn broke. The square returned to its ordinary rhythm, wagons creaking through the mud, dogs barking, children running. But though the wood was hauled away, the rope cut down. The memory of what had happened lingered like smoke in the air. The people of the town spoke of it in hushed tones over supper, in taverns, in church pews. Some tried to erase it, as if silence could swallow the image of a young girl standing tall before the noose. Others could not let it go. For them, Sarah's last words hung heavier than the rope itself. White planters in the county felt the sting most sharply. They walked their fields with tighter grips on their canes, their eyes sharper on the men and women who bent in the rows. The story of Sarah had spread too far, too fast, and it had planted seeds of unease. Where once they saw their slaves as docile as cattle, now they wondered which pair of eyes might hold defiance, which hand might reach for ascent. A pair might reach for a blade. Hale's death was one man's end, but the fear it stirred was shared across 1,000 estates. For the enslaved, the story traveled like a secret song, whispered from ear to ear around campfires carved into memory. It gave no promise of freedom. It offered no path to safety, but it gave proof that even chains could not stop a soul from striking back. Some told it with tears, others with pride. Mothers held their children close and said her name, Sarah, as if speaking it aloud might pass her strength into the next generation. In fields where whips cracked and overseers barked, her memory lived as a quiet defiance, a flame carried in silence. In the North, her name took another shape. Abolitionist papers seized on the story, filling their columns with her trial, her words, her death. They painted her not as criminal, but as martyr, a victim of slavery's cruelty, forced into desperate act. They wrote that her blood cried out against the system itself. They spoke her name in meetings, in churches and halls where men and women gathered to demand an end to bondage. Sermons rose with her memory woven into the call for justice. Songs were written, ballads sung in lamplight, telling of the girl who struck back. The image of Sarah standing calm before the gallows became a symbol carved deep into the conscience of those who long fought to end slavery. But her story did not unite the nation, it divided it further. In the South, her act was used as warning. Planters hardened their laws. Patrols doubled punishments, grew harsher. They said leniency would lead to blood. They said kindness would be answered with knives. The whip grew heavier, not lighter, and yet in their attempt to crush defiance, they spread her name even more. Every line, warning spoken to slaves, carried her story. Every lash meant to silence, only reminded of her cry time, did not erase her memory. It wove her into the larger fabric of the nation's unraveling. The 1840s passed into the 1850s, and talk of slavery grew hotter, more dangerous. Her story appeared again in speeches of men who warned the South that its cruelty would birth more Sarahs, more bloodshed. They spoke of her in the same breath as revolts and uprisings in far plantations. Her name was no longer just a name, but a symbol whispered in fear and in hope. Even after the Civil War, when the fields lay empty of chains and the old order collapsed, Sarah's story did not fade. Freedmen gathered in churches and schools built from scraps of wood, and they told their children about her. They told them of a girl who had been taken as a child, who had suffered beyond words, but who found the strength to rise. They did not tell it as a tragedy, but as a lesson. Courage sometimes comes at the cost of life, but courage leaves a mark that outlives death. Historians decades later dug through court records, newspapers, fragments of testimony, piecing together her trial. Some dismissed it as myth, others insisted it was truth. The lines blurred as stories carried through generations grew larger than the facts, but that is the way of legends. Sarah was not remembered for dates and documents. She was remembered for defiance, for standing when every chain said kneel, for lifting her voice in a courtroom where slaves were meant to be silent, for meeting the news, not with cries, but with words that still echoed, "I chose to live for one moment as mine, not his." Her grave never bore her name. The earth where she was buried lay unmarked, the weeds growing tall over the years, but those who remembered did not need stone to mark her. They carried her in their voices, in their whispers, in their prayers, and in time, her name found its way into books, into stories, into the long memory of a nation wrestling with its past. To speak of Sarah today is to speak of more than one girl on one plantation. It is to speak of every woman and man who lived under the hand of a master. It is to speak of every scar hidden under rags, every song sung in darkness, every tear swallowed in silence. Her act was not just her own. It was the cry of thousands who could not raise a hand but longed to. It was the proof that no system, no law, no chain could crush the will to resist. The past does not fade, no matter how much time piles upon it. It lingers in soil, in stone, in blood. Sarah's story lingers still. She was a child taken and used. She was a woman beaten and silenced. She was a slave who became in one act more free than her master ever was. Her life ended on a rope, but her defiance lives beyond death. When the old photographs of that era are studied, when the names of planters and towns are sifted through, Sarah's face is not there. No portraits, no likeness, no painted frame, but her presence fills the silence of those images. Her voice fills the gaps of history. For behind every proud figure in fine clothes, there were voices like hers, voices hidden, erased, but unbroken. Her story is a reminder that history is not just written by the powerful, it is carved by the powerless who dared to rise on. So the tale of Sarah, the slave girl who killed her master, is not just a tale of murder, or trial, or death. It is the tale of resistance, of the human will to claim even a single breath of freedom. No matter the cost, it is a reminder carried across centuries that the fight for dignity is never wasted, that even in the darkest night, one act of defiance can burn like a star. Her name may not be etched in stone, but it is etched in the conscience of America, a name whispered in fields, sung in hymns, spoken in books. Sarah, a girl who turned years of abuse into one final act of deadly revenge. And in doing so, she became more than a victim, more than a killer. She became a symbol of the truth. Slavery sought to hide that the human spirit, no matter how chained, will always seek to rise.